Why don't you turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12. This is the story of a guy named Abraham. I never really liked Abraham. He was just an old guy that didn't really mean anything to me. But I wanted to know faith. I wanted to understand faith. And so the Lord made it clear to me that I would never really understand faith unless I looked at the father of faith. Abraham was the first person to walk with God by faith, who became the friend of God. The first person whose life was written and his journey of faith was written, and it was written for us. And it's before the law, so it's really almost everything that applies to him applies to a New Testament Christian, just because it's pre-law. And the first thing we learn in chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, his name was Abram. It got changed to Abraham, but we'll talk about that later. He's get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So verse 4, Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him. And he took Lot. He's 75 years old at this time, but people are living much longer. And so he's probably middle-aged. But this is a profound thing. God wants to work a work in Abram. So he says, I need to take you alone. I need to take you out in the wilderness, take you to a place you've never been before, away from family, everything familiar, your land, your country. There's something about God taking us on a journey and taking us to a place we've never been before to work a work within us. So there's a pattern where people who migrate, who go from place to place or country to country, oftentimes experience personal revival. And I think it has to do with being out of their element, away from everything familiar, where all they have to rely on is the Lord. He does this so often that it becomes a pattern. Almost every time you see a major migration, you'll see revival. And in New York, in our history here in New York, the people came from England, Scotland, Ireland, and the Irish had a revival, and there was a great awakening among the people. And then they began to migrate and go further west where there was nothing. Those who went west seemed to have revival. You can trace it all the way to California, where California had the largest churches in the world, or in America at least, because of that migration. I think it's a pattern in God. And so then they began to migrate to Florida. At one time, Florida had no air conditioning. It was very hot. They invented air conditioning. People began to migrate to Florida. And as a result, the biggest churches ended up in Florida because people came to know the Lord. And this pattern, it makes me wonder what God's after when we see the migration from Venezuela, Central America, South America. I think revival's coming among those people. Right now, it's very tense. All they have is the Lord. The governments against them. They can't go forward. They can't go backwards. It's a perfect place to get to know the Lord. Abraham didn't know the Lord at all, but he's about to get to know the Lord. And we get to watch the process that God takes him through for him to get to know the Lord. He says some interesting things here. He says, I will bless you. and you will be a blessing. That little phrase, I will bless you, is worth more than gold. It's worth more than anything. And we're going to see the effect of those 4 words, I will bless you. When I became a pastor for the first time in northern New York, up near the Canadian border, we had a very small church. It was a little bit larger than this room here, longer, a little more wide, but not much. It was small, had no money, very few people. But this verse became alive to me. So I took my paintbrushes, my pencil, my ruler, and I went and I wrote on the wall in big letters, I will bless you. I needed to see it, but our people needed to see it. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. I just knew somehow that little church was going to impact the world. We're going to go all over the world and go to the nations. And even though we're small, we had nothing. I had faith to believe that God's blessing was everything. Those who bless you, I will bless them. And when you travel, especially when you go in other places, other countries, I've been to numerous places by myself where you feel vulnerable, you feel at risk. It's interesting to see the ones that the Lord uses to help you, that He blesses them. And if your heart, I suppose, I think it really is contingent upon our heart wanting to be a blessing. To curse someone isn't just to speak a curse about them. It's to doom them to failure. A curse is saying, you're no good. You will never make it. You're not worth anything. That's a curse. And there's different ways that people do it, demonstrate it, and say it. But he says, if anyone is your enemy, they become my enemy. I'll look after them. You don't have to do anything. You just keep walking. I'll look after them. In verse 3, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. It's talking about Jesus. It's because of Jesus coming from Abraham that we are in this room today, that we are blessed. And we're going to look at that a little more closely as we leave. So he goes on this journey in a place where he's never been before. His brother had a son named Lot, and he went with him. And so they departed into the land of Canaan. And all these places are still there today. In verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So there he built an altar. And the Lord appears to him at different times, in different ways. And that's part of the blessing, that he gets to see the Lord, he gets to know the Lord. And verse 10, the first thing that happened as he got out, away from everything, is a famine hit the world, the known world. What's the word famine in Spanish?
Hambruna.
Have you ever seen a famine before? Have you ever been part of a famine?
No part of one. We have heard about
You've heard of it? It's a time when nothing grows. There's economically, everyone is working with their hands to grow food. It's an agricultural economy. And now, during this time, nothing grows. It's a famine. So, the first test for Abraham is the economy goes broke. So he gets in line just like everybody else. Everyone gets in line to go down to Egypt. Egypt's very wealthy. It's the most developed country on the earth at that point in time. So he goes down to Egypt, but this word, I will bless you, hasn't really got down into his heart yet. So he's afraid. He's afraid that they're going to take his wife, and she's good looking, and they're going to take his wife and kill him. So he says, let's tell everybody a lie. It's a half lie, but it's a lie. And they're actually related. And so he's not really convinced that God's going to help him, that God will take care of his enemies. And so he says, tell them that you're my sister. And so verse 16, the Pharaoh, he treated him well, and he gives Abram sheep, oxen, verse 16, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. So part of the word that Abram got from God is, I will bless you. So people just give to him. And that's part of the blessing of God. It's part of the favor of God. When I was a little boy, the favor of God was upon me. And my brother told me not too long ago, a few years ago, he was very upset with me and was crying and upset. And he said, God's favor has always been upon you. Someone would come to the house and they'd give you a chocolate bar and give us nothing. Oh. And that happened. I never thought about it as being the favor of God upon me. But I didn't realize how much it bothered him. But he said, everything you do, God blesses it. Everything that happens to you, we know God's favor is upon you. And it was bothering him. But I realized there was something true in that. It just seemed like people connected with me even from a child. But I was the only one who really had a relationship or a contact with the Lord, not even a full relationship. God, the moment that I met him as a child, I felt his blessing came upon me. I began to draw. I didn't know I could draw. One day I was drawing and a picture came out. I was shocked that anything happened, that something, I could draw anything at all. And I was showing my parents because I was just so surprised. And I from the time I was a child, I had a vision that somehow one day I'd be a minister. Someday God was going to use me. I knew somehow that I was going to go around the world. The only subjects I was good in school were geography and history, and that became part of my life. And so there was a blessing on me. I know something of what he's experiencing here. So he goes down to Egypt, as you know. It doesn't go well with him. He finds the king finds out that it really is his sister, and he sends him away. But now, even though he's made a mistake, and he goes back to the very stone, the stone where he left, where he had prayed before he left, he goes back to the very stone that he anointed with oil. So there's something about the blessing of the Lord where you will make mistakes. It doesn't mean you're perfect, and you'll come back to where you started. But meanwhile, you'll come away richer than what you had before you went in. It just seems like even your mistakes, God uses to enrich your life. And I think that's true in my life. Many of the things that I've made, where I've made mistakes, I've gotten truth. I've gotten to know the Lord. I've gotten to experience his protection, his provision. But it really came out of my own wanderings, my own insecurities. So I think what I like about this story, Abraham is not perfect. He's as ordinary as you and me. He was concerned about them taking his wife. Well, I get that. God's not blaming him. He just hasn't really got it deep in his heart yet that God's going to bless him and God will take care of those who try to hurt him. So anyway, the way this, the Lord showed up, Pharaoh just all of a sudden couldn't conceive. He had problems in his marriage, and that's what the Lord used to get his attention, that somehow he connected the dots. This has to do with this man, Abraham, and his wife. So they go back. They go back, and he's now, verse 2, he's very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. How he got this, it must have just been given to him in Egypt, but there are people who don't like Jewish people because everything that they touch becomes, they come ahead. They get the advantage in silver and gold and livestock. There's something about whatever was put on Abraham was put on all his descendants. And that includes us as Christians, and we'll see that more plainly here in a few minutes. Verse 4, he goes back to the same place where he started. And then Lot comes to him, and there's a problem in verse 7, strife between Lot's herdsmen and Abram's herdsmen. They're beginning to fight because there's so much blessing. There's so many sheep and goats that now there's conflict. And you would think having abundance of everything would solve your problems. It can actually create problems. So here's what happens. This word, I will bless you, is just starting to get into his heart. Enough that he said to Lot, take whatever you want. Take the best land, go with your herds. I'll take whatever's left. And you can't do that unless you have an awareness somehow that God's with you. God's for you. He's not against you. So Lot, as we know, he takes the best land, the most fertile plain. It turns out to be a big mistake. The whole thing with Lot being stolen in the plains of Jordan, and he ends up having lots of conflict. But verse 14, the Lord says to Abraham, after Lot had left, lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I'll give to you and to your descendants forever. And I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth. So if the man could count the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. This tremendous blessing. Right now, he's got nothing. He has no children. He just sent away kind of a half-son, his brother's son. And so he says, now arise, walk through the land, and wherever your foot comes down, I'm going to give it to you. So Abraham is super blessed by the Lord, but he can't see it yet. It's all by faith. And now if we were watching a movie, we'd hear the bass violins and they'd go, doo-doo-dum, ba-da-dum, trouble's coming. There's these bad kings. They're like motorcycle men with, horns on their helmets, and they're like Vikings. They're really rough men. And they come against Lot. They steal him. And so Abraham, he flies into action. And verse 14, he gets 300 of his servants. So now he's got staff. He's got a lot of people working for him, managing his sheep and his goats and his donkeys and his camels. He's got 300 farmers. They're husbandmen. And so they're not fighters. They probably don't even really have real weapons. They might have some camel staffs, some sheep staffs, some rods. They're not really built for war, but Abraham somehow is beginning to believe that I can go against these 5 kings, these horrible men, evil men, and God will protect me. God will look after me. So he goes out and fights, and he's not a fighter, and he wins. It's the most amazing thing. He wins and gets Lot back, gets everything that belongs to him, because now the blessing of the Lord is upon him. And those who come against Abraham, God comes against them. And so this promise now is starting to show up in his everyday life. And it gets even more interesting. So he's got 318 trained soldiers. And they brought back all the goods. Verse 16. And they brought back the women, the people. Now, verse 17, the king of Sodom went out, and he says, well, there's something about, yeah, okay, so the king of Sodom's in the mix of this whole thing, but there's another king named Melchizedek. That's how I say it. I'm not sure how it's really pronounced in Judaism. How is this pronounced, verse 18, in Spanish?
Melchizedek.
Oh, yeah.
The same.
We say Melchizedek. He's the king of Salem, which is the king of peace. And he comes out with bread and wine, the communion elements. And he comes out, he's called the priest of the God Most High. And he blesses Abram, verse 19. He said, "Blessed be Abram of the God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth. So I bless you in the name of the God who owns everything." He owns everything, and he likes you. He owns everything, and he's for you. He owns everything, and he's wanting to bless you. And he's the one who's delivered you from your enemies. So that must have been amazing to hear. Abram hears these words from a complete stranger. Melchizedek had no beginning, no end. It's actually a little vision of Jesus. He's the Prince of Peace. He's the King of Peace, coming out with wine and bread. It's a vision of Jesus before Jesus was. There's several of those in the Bible. And so when he blessed Abram, the first thing Abram did in response that came out of his heart is he tithed. Tithe is giving 10% of everything you have. So his reaction was to give. And there are people who are not, they don't give, they don't tithe because they don't trust God to bless them. But when you're full of the blessing of God, when you are aware of the promise of God, I am for you. I'm not against you. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. I will help you. I will be with you. Wherever you go, I will be with you. I will bless you, and you shall be a blessing. When that word begins to get down into your heart, you can give. Your life changes from being someone who's always trying to get to someone who's always trying to give. And so the first thing that happens in verse 19 or verse 20 is he tithes 10% of everything he owned. The king of Sodom says, okay, there's a big mountain of what come from that war. And he says, I'll take the people, you can have the stuff. Abraham says, I've raised my hand to the Lord, the God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth. Now, I don't know when he did this. After he heard Melchizedek, or was it before, and Melchizedek is now confirming. But somehow, in Abram's heart, he made a promise before God. I'll never get rich unless it's by your blessing. I don't have to steal. I don't have to beg. I don't have to depend on other people. It doesn't matter what the economy does. All I know is I have your blessing. So he made this vow, this promise. No one will be able to say, I made Abram rich. The only reason I'm rich is because of God, who owns everything. He owns heaven. He owns everything in the earth. There's been times when we've needed buildings and we've said to the Lord, that building belongs to you. If it pleases you to give it to us, we'll use it for your kingdom. But we just believe he owns everything. If he wants to give it to us, he can. That word has gotten down into my heart. It has changed how I think, how I respond to difficulty. Doesn't matter when I have enemies rise up against me. It doesn't matter. God will bless me. He'll take care of those who curse me. It's really important that we believe this promise. He said, the men who went with me, give them some stuff if you like, but for me, I'm satisfied with the blessing of the Lord. Now, chapter 15, verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. So Abram's actually a prophet. He's seeing from the Lord. He's hearing from the Lord. No one on earth is experiencing this. He's the only one who's really having this kind of relationship with the Lord. He's, don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield and your exceedingly great reward. And then he says, Lord, what will you give me? Once you have stuff, once you have everything you could ever ask for, it's never enough unless you have someone that you can give it to, someone to share it with. It's like watching a sunset. It's not as much pleasure watching a sunset or a sunrise unless you can share with somebody. That's just the way life is. He just says, well, more stuff isn't going to do it. More stuff isn't going to bless me. I want someone to give it with. He's the only thing I have is this guy who works for me, Eliezer. I have him, and I have no offspring, no heir. There's a certain point where you start thinking, who am I going to leave this stuff with? And the word of the Lord came to him and says, this one, good guy, but he's not going to be your heir. There's going to be an heir coming from your own body. Verse 4. And then God is the God of never-ending encouragement. He said, Abram, get out of your tent. Come on, out of your tent. So Abram gets out, and it's a starry night. He's on the hills of Judea, and you can almost reach up and touch the stars. There's so many of them. They're so bright, and they're just above your head. And he says, Abram, count the stars. And he goes, uno, dos, tres. And he says, I can't. There's so many stars. He said, if you could count them, that's how many children you're going to have. It must have just blown his mind. What an amazing revelation. God just wanting to encourage him. And so Abraham, he believed. He believed that God would never lie to him. He believed, I believe I'm going to have this many children. He believed God. And God says, I will treat you as if you're completely righteous with me because you believed in me. It's righteousness by faith. That's my experience. I had the same kind of experience. I just believed God's word. I believed in Jesus. I believed in what he did. And God says, now you're right with me. Not based on you doing everything right, but because you believe in me. God loved that. So few people believed him. Abraham just believed that he'd never lie. You can read that in Romans chapter 4, that he just took God at his word. He looked at his body and he said, this body can't produce children, but God says I can. My wife, her womb is dead, but God says she's going to conceive. I mean, it's just an amazing thing. And so he enters into a relationship, a covenant with the Lord. But during the covenant, he has a vision, and the vision is his seed, his children, going into a nightmare of a situation, and that's called Egypt. And it's for 430 years, and he has a very dark dream about this taking place. So the blessing of the Lord doesn't mean God won't deal with you. It doesn't mean that bad things don't happen. It's just that he'll be with you in it. He'll look after you. He'll make sure that it turns out right for you. Chapter 16, he's so much like us. He's looking at this whole thing, and now Sarah, she believes that the promise is true, but she can't conceive. It keeps going on. From the time he said it, I think there's a 25-year period where nothing happens. There's a time of waiting. There's a gap. It's called the work of waiting. And so his wife says, well, I want a baby. I want a child. Go sleep with my handmaiden, Hagar. And they come up with a plan that was not God's plan. And next thing you know, they have an Ishmael. And that's what happens when you go into business for yourself, or you say, I'm going to go fishing, or I'm going back in the business, or you're not willing to wait, you'll produce Ishmaels. And that's what happened in this story. It's an amazing story about Hagar, but we can't really get into it very much, except in verse 13. She meets the Lord as well, and she calls the name of the place. An angel appears to her, and she calls the name of the place, the God who sees me. There's something about knowing that the Lord sees you, that he knows you're there. It has a powerful effect on you, had a powerful effect on Haggai.